Past and Present is the title of this year's edition of Global Axess. Is it possible to draw conclusions from past events? Or is man doomed to repeat the mistakes of yesterday? How do authoritarian regimes use their own country's history to secure power? And what role does the individual play? In these interviews, researchers, journalists and writers try to answer these questions. Based on the Thucydides trap, an idea that describes the dangers between aspiring and dominant powers, historian Graham Allison talks to Thomas Gür about the risk of a military confrontation between China and the United States. Studying history is not a guarantee of peace, but according to Allison, it is the best option given the alternatives.
Before we go into the relation between the United States and China, let's talk briefly about the concept of the Thucydides trap. We are speaking about the Greek historian Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. What was the trap?
Well, Thucydides trap is a term I coined about a decade ago to make vivid Thucydides Insight. And Thucydides Insight about Thucydides trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power, like Athens 2,500 years ago, or China today, threatens to displace a ruling power, like Sparta, which had ruled Greece for 100 years, or America, who's become accustomed to an American century. So the basic idea is that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, alarm bells should sound, extreme danger ahead, most often war.
The extreme danger is war. And I think you made also a study of the last 500 years where you described the Thucydides trap situation between ascending and declining powers, or incumbent powers and ascending powers, 16 of them, and 12 of them led to war.
Exactly. So in order to try to understand what's happening in the relationship between the U.S. and China, I believe very much that we should apply history. So by applying history, that means looking at the historical record for precedents, analogs that may illuminate the general phenomena. So to make it a limited study, I studied the last 500 years. And at Harvard, we have the Thucydides trap case file. We've identified so far 16 cases, as you say, in which a rising power threatened to displace a major ruling power. In 12 of those cases, the outcome was war. In 4 of the cases, the outcome was not war.
But in those 4 cases, there was still a change of power.
Well, in those 4 cases, each is interestingly different. So the case file starts at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, with the rise of Spain to rival Portugal. This is about the time of Christopher Columbus. And ends with the current ongoing case of the rise of Germany in the aftermath of the Cold War to become the dominant power in Europe. But in those cases, 2 non-wars were the rise of the U.S., first to rival and then surpass Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. But the second is the Cold War, in which a surging Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s eventually sputtered, didn't succeed in displacing the U.S., and actually collapsed. So each one of the cases has got important nuanced differences from which we can try to draw lessons.
So the trap is more or less describing a conflict, but not necessarily an outcome.
Right, exactly. And that's a very, very important point. The trap is this dangerous dynamic. In this dangerous dynamic, if you're the ruling power and I'm the rising power, you think that what I'm about is trying to displace you, when in fact all I may be doing is try to realize my own well-being. I believe that you're trying to hold me down, even though you're basically not thinking so much about me. So first you have a reality in which the rising power, by getting bigger and stronger, is inevitably encroaching on positions and prerogatives that the ruling power has come to think of as naturally its own. That then gets magnified and misperceived when it goes through the psychology and emotions of a rising power that thinks, yikes, I'm getting bigger and stronger. I deserve more say and sway. And a ruling power that thinks, what's going on here? This upstart is trying to disrupt me. And then finally you get the politics in it within each of the two capitals, in which nobody wants anybody to be to their right on a national security issue. And this sort of dangerous cocktail leaves both parties vulnerable to some third party's action or even an accident that triggers a set of reactions that drags them to a war, often a war that neither of them wanted.
This is interesting because I think also Thucydides, when it describes the conflict between Athens and Sparta, speaks about the fear of Sparta, of Athens, not necessarily the challenge of Athens, but the fear. So fear and the psychological factor is obviously, or the misapprehension of the balance is also an important element.
Three layers. You've got it exactly. So he's got the reality. I really am encroaching on your prerogatives. So that's a fact. But then your perception of it, which often exaggerates and gets caught up in emotions, that's the fear that he talks about. And then the politics, where if you're not being tough to me, somebody else who's your political opponent says, you're being too soft. So all those things work together in this cocktail that then when something external happens, so in the case of Athens and Sparta, Pericles had brilliantly negotiated the 30-year peace. They were now in the 15th year. There comes to be a conflict between Corinth and Corcyra, which ends up dragging the two parties into a war that neither Athens nor Sparta wanted. And that's the danger in the current U.S.-Chinese relationship. Fortunately, nobody in China wants a war with the U.S. And nobody in the U.S. wants a war with China. It's the risk of something happening in Taiwan or something happening in North Korea, something happening in the South China Sea, that in the case in which the actual understanding is discombobulated by the misperceptions that come from the increasing tension in the relationship, that these external events could have this triggering effect.
So to go further into the Chinese-U.S. relations in the sense that in both capitals, there is also, in a way, sense in the Thucydidean term that whatever China does is targeting the United States in one way or other. Not necessarily so, but that's the interpretation. And in Beijing, so whatever Washington does is in order to circumvent China's rightful place or one way or other stop it from expanding.
Exactly.
So that is the psychological factor in a way.
And that's exactly what Thucydides would say, watching. He would say, wait a minute, China, when Xi Jinping says China's objective is simply to make China great again, this is mainly about China. So Athens was not about Sparta. Athens was about trying to realize Athens' dream of a democracy that was going to invent everything, that was going to build buildings like the Acropolis, that was...
or make their allies pay for Acropolis.
Make their allies pay, but in any case, Athens was not about Sparta. It was Athens about Athens. Sparta was at the time ruling Greece and its allies, but was mainly not about Athens, though it didn't want to be challenged. It wanted the deference that was due to the great power. But basically, in that circumstance, Corinth, which was always a troublesome ally, and the Spartans didn't like the Corinthians at all, but nonetheless, when the Corinthians got into a fight with Corcyra, which was basically Corfu now, that had a navy, one thing led to the other, and by the end, everybody was dragged to a war that they knew. Pericles was pretty clear this was going to be a bad outcome, so he was very afraid of this. And Thucydides, who fought in that war on behalf of Athens, was also very cautious about how this was going to work out, and it was correct. By the end of it, both city-states had been pretty much destroyed, and the Persians were able to come back. Yeah.
your first book, which is the most well-known, which still in a way, I guess, never leaves you, is the essence of decision on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Was that a similar situation in a way that what happened on the island of Castro in a way dragged the Soviets and the Kennedy administration into a deadlock of not wished for?
Yes and no. I would say, fortunately, in this case, the missile crisis was initiated by Khrushchev having tried to place nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. And Castro was eager to become an independent player. If he had succeeded in becoming an independent player, as would have happened in the Thucydidean story, lo and behold, for sure we would have had a war. So Castro wanted to fire the missiles that were in place in Cuba at the end of the missile crisis. And there's a fascinating letter that he writes to Khrushchev when Khrushchev has agreed to withdraw the missiles, saying, do not withdraw these missiles. Fire them against the Americans now. And Khrushchev concluded from this that Castro was out of his mind. Mm-hmm. So fortunately, the third party didn't succeed in being the provocateur, but not for want of trying.
I guess we have to look at the last Thucydides trap confrontation that was on global scale, the one before, that is the Cold War and the relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. That Cold War never became a hot war. And they were, in a way, the superpowers were able to avoid war. Why were they able to avoid the Thucydides trap?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and I try to explore that in the book, in the chapter on the Cold War, and I believe it needs to be much more studied. But basically, the defining characteristic of the Cold War was that it was not hot. That is, it involved every form of conflict, proxy wars, intelligence wars, economic wars, every version except bombs and bullets. Thank goodness. Now, one big reason was that as the two sides had developed nuclear arsenals that could destroy each other, one got into a world of so-called MAD, or mutual assured destruction. So if I conclude that there's a war with you, I'm also concluding I'm committing suicide. That creates a great caution. That was a big effect. And that's relevant in the Chinese case today.
Yeah. So that is one of the lessons in a way.
That's one of the big lessons
from the Cold War, that there is a mutual assured destruction, and that both parties should have it in mind or be aware of.
And that should therefore lead rational actors to avoid a war that would be suicidal.
Yes.
So I've written about this. This in effect, technology makes the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or now the U.S. and China, insufferable, inseparable Siamese twins. So it's as if we've somehow found ourselves with our respiratory system entangled, so that even if you decide I deserve to be strangled, you think about it and think, if I strangle him, I'm probably going to kill myself, so I don't want to do that. So that creates a huge caution. Yeah. That's certainly right. But even in that case, some third party's action can lead the two of us, as in the case of the missile crisis, to a confrontation that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy thought rightly that there was a 1 in 3 chance this would have ended in nuclear Armageddon. But he still played out the hand. So despite the fact of the nuclear weapons, that doesn't sort of settle the problem. Well, another dimension of it in the Cold War was the ultimate underlying economic competition. If the Soviet Union's economy, run by a command and control system, had succeeded the way it was doing in the 1950s and overtaken and surpassed the U.S., this might have turned out to be a quite different story.
Yes.
In fact, ultimately, this system faltered compared to the market-based systems in the West. And that basically then hollowed out the Soviet Union, or undermined its capacity. Thirdly, the Soviet Union had this cockamamie philosophy that revolutionary communism was going to expand to control the world. As it was thwarted, as basically countries didn't want to become communists before they were Chinese or Poles or Germans. The theology was undermined by the contradictions that George Kennan identified in the first place. So in the end, the Soviet Union collapsed. But there were a series of crises in the course of this competition, often involving third parties, that could, if mishandled, have dragged the two into war, despite the fact that they understood it would be a nuclear war, and despite the fact that they understood that would be suicidal.
So, but was it purely luck that the third parties or the proxy wars didn't develop into a hot war between the two parties, or were there other mechanisms that were able?
Well, over time, and this is one of the great learnings that occurred in the missile crisis for Kennedy. After the missile crisis, Kennedy walked away a different person. He had come to office as a really deeply, a personally committed Cold Warrior. He had run a campaign against Richard Nixon in 1960, in which he argued basically that Nixon was soft on communism because he had let the Soviet Union take over Cuba. He had allowed it to develop this missile gap in which the Soviets were said to be able to have a capability to coerce the U.S. So now he comes to the missile crisis, but he feels, wait a minute, I'm just about to take actions that may kill several hundred million people. I mean, what about this? So his main takeaway from the missile crisis, as he said often, was that in the nuclear age, superpowers must avert crises that bring their opponent to a choice between humiliation and nuclear war. So
always leave an outcome.
So therefore, he began developing with Khrushchev, and then that ultimately evolved a set of ways to communicate. That was a hotline. He initiated the moratorium on nuclear weapons tests, understanding that nuclear tests put strontium into the air. Everybody drinks it in their milk. It's bad for everyone's children. So the beginning of even understanding that we live in a limited biosphere. Then ultimately that was the limited test ban treaty. Then the negotiations about the non-proliferation treaty, where there was a shared interest. So over time, there came to be an appreciation at this point that Ronald Reagan, whom I also had the opportunity to work for, put, I think, most brilliantly in his favorite one-liner. He said, remember this, a nuclear war cannot be won and must therefore never be fought. So that's a profound constraint on a competition and a reason for caution and being concerned about third-party actions that could have this triggering effect.
Is that what you have also coined as a term of understanding the rules of status quo?
Absolutely. That's what Kennedy called them, the precarious rules of the status quo, but the definition of them and the clarification of them evolves. So a question, can, in the Cold War, I send non-uniformed CIA officers to fight alongside Mujahideen in Afghanistan against Soviet occupiers? Yes. But could I send armed, or could I send uniformed? Well, that seemed too dangerous. Could nuclear weapons be used at all? Or should there be a taboo on any use of nuclear weapons? Each time American presidents got up to that threshold, they looked at it and said, don't step over that. So there came to be the so-called nuclear taboo. So these evolved over time as the two parties took the measure of each other and of how existentially each other challenged, felt itself challenged. In the American-Chinese competition, unfortunately, there's not been much of this kind of communication to get a clearer sense of this. So, for example, in Taiwan today, what the U.S. is doing is emboldening Taiwan to move towards greater independence. Xi Jinping has been expressing essentially an impatience about resolving the Taiwan issue and has said that he's going to get it resolved on his watch. So this is an extremely dangerous situation right now, especially since Taiwan's coming up to a new presidential election in January, and where the candidates competing with each other are tempted to propose to their citizens that we can be more independent than their competitors.
Just before we go into how this the MAD doctrine, the nuclear standoff, rules of understanding, the rules of status quo applies to the American-Chinese case, I would, however, like to just shortly develop on the ideas that there were that tactical nuclear weapons were possible to use on the arena. Yes. NATO had this doctrine of flexible response, and also there is the Russian doctrine, of course, that doesn't exclude nowadays use of tactical nuclear weapons. Still, although all these signals of danger from a Thucydides trap concept, we haven't had use of nuclear warheads or nuclear weapons except for the two cases of 1945.
One of the amazing things about international politics is that here we are, almost 7 decades after the first use of nuclear weapons and no additional use. So my former colleague Tom Schelling wrote and talked about this as the emergence of the nuclear taboo, as if, another one of these constraints on the game. But we should remember how we got there. For the U.S. And NATO, when the Soviets were thought to have an overwhelming conventional advantage in forces during the Cold War. So the thought was the U.S. had, in NATO, 5 divisions, and the Soviets had 100 divisions. How would the U.S. deal with it? The equalizer was tactical nuclear weapons. And tactical nuclear weapons were distributed down to the company level. And even though there was an official chain of command, if I were the company commander, if I decided to use the tactical nuclear weapons, there was no barrier to my doing so. In the current setting, fortunately, the Chinese have basically ruled their nuclear weapons as kind of a reserve in the closet. So they've not built up a superpower nuclear arsenal of the way that the U.S. and the Soviet Union and now Russia did. They have a reliable retaliatory capability, but basically what in nuclear theology would be called a minimum deterrent, essentially. But in the Russian story today, given Russian relative weakness compared to U.S. and NATO, Putin has elevated the use of tactical nuclear weapons as one of the quite feasible strategies. They even practice this in their exercises. And if there should be a use of tactical nuclear weapons, where does that stop?
Yes.
That was the risk always in the previous cases, but it was not a risk that the U.S. was not prepared to take when we thought we were so weak. It was one that actually, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, recognizing that tactical nuclear weapons might have been used even if he didn't order them. That's when the U.S. finally got the good idea you should develop permissive action links, or essentially electronic locks on the weapons that mean that a company commander cannot use them until he's gotten the code that comes through the chain of command, and therefore this makes sure that only the commander-in-chief can order an attack.
Getting back to the Chinese-U.S. relations, there is a limited MAD doctrine in a sense, but you also mentioned, and which we could develop on briefly, there are not quite established rules of status quo conduct between the U.S. and China. Why?
Well, I think that it's only recently that the U.S. has kind of wakened up to the fact that this is a rising rival that is actually displacing the U.S. in many dimensions and is on a trajectory to overtake or displace the U.S. in almost every arena. So you've seen in the last several years, in part my book helps, I think, clarify what's actually happening with in this rivalry, which then makes people taking more account. So secondly, the rise of China has been so meteoric that, as Václav Havel put it, things have happened so fast.
We haven't understood it yet.
Right. But he had this wonderful line. He said, things have happened so fast, we haven't yet had time to be astonished. So when you look at it, it is astonishing. And I try to capture that in the first chapter of my book on basically the rise of China. But I was in 2 weeks ago at the Jeju conference in Korea, because they were asking how could Korea be part of the trigger to a Thucydidean conflict. And an American ambassador, who had every reason to know much better, came up after and he said, you keep saying China's a rising power. I don't believe China's a rising power. I said, excuse me? He said, I think they're stumbling and whatever. So I went back and had my research assistant prepare one of these little, stick figure charts. If you take China at the end of the Cold War, so 1991, and the U.S. and compare them, China is about 2% of the U.S. in most dimensions. And if you take China and the U.S. today, in GDP measured by purchasing power parity, China is larger than the U.S.
Yes.
So all this thing has happened like in an instant. So that's the second reason. Thirdly, I think that unfortunately neither American nor Chinese statesmen have been involved in deep conversations about how to constrain Thucydides' trap. The quality of the diplomacy, and especially of the high-level conversations, both in the Obama administration and in the Trump administration, have been, I think, poor, and that's unfortunate. I think actually I blame the American side for this more than I blame the Chinese side, because it seems to me that as the rising power, they're learning more. We've been there before. We can understand the lessons of the Cold War, so we should be taking a lead in these conversations. And I wish that was happening. But if you go back to the, if you were to look at the transcripts we as political scientists and historians if you looked at the transcripts of the Kissinger, Chou and Lai conversations and compared them with the transcripts of Obama and Xi or Trump and Xi, you would we would be appalled.
I guess we will be disappointed, very much disappointed.
We'd be appalled.
Yes. Yeah. Finally, to conclude, there is a fifth lesson from the Cold War that you have mentioned, and is that we shouldn't build our strategies on hope. That sounds a bit dismal, or is it more realism speaking?
Well, I'm when people say you're an optimist or a pessimist, I say I'm an optimist, but who worries a lot. Okay, so I think that we should recognize that we are facing a historic challenge of Thucydidean proportions. That most often this turns out poorly. That if we settle for business as usual, imagination as usual, statecraft as usual, we should expect history as usual. And history as usual in this case would be not just tragic, but even catastrophic. So that should be a spur to imagination and adaptability. And I think that I've been, for the 2.5 years since I sent this book to the publisher, been searching for ways to escape Thucydides' trap. And I'm hopeful that I've found a few clues. I've talked to a lot of people about this. I'm still looking and listening. So actually, there's no monopoly of wisdom for sure on this topic in Washington or in Beijing, where I go every month or two. This is something everybody can think about. Everybody has a stake in. So I've been inviting people everywhere to say, think about it. You can look at this as well as anybody else. What would be some thoughts and suggestions about how these two great powers could find a way to live together, since the alternative would be to die together and maybe kill the rest of us?
Well, that's at least a call to action for everybody, isn't it? So thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much.